Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Glasso, and I'm excited to be with you today to look at a proposed implementation guide for the GASB, specifically focused on subsidies. So subsidies is a key area when you're looking specifically at a lot of our proprietary funds. So this is looking at educational institutions like universities, hospitals, as well as airports, right? So those are really the big players here having questions about some of the changes from GASB 103. So remember, GASB 103 made changes to the financial reporting model, not just in the area of MD&A, right? That's the one that gets most attention, but there were changes to the proprietary funds, including a definition of subsidy. So now we are standardizing how we treat them, how we present them. And so this was issued in February of 26, and comments are going to be due later this year in order to address some questions about whether something meets this definition or not, and what kind of adjustments that we can make. The way they do these implementation guides is a set of Q&A. So they give you a question and then they give you the answer. So the first one is related to, no surprise, hospitals. And this is one that was popping up right away, which is a government provides supplemental payments to hospitals in addition to the standard contractual Medicare-based payments made on a fee-for-service or managed care basis. In this circumstance, the supplemental payments are not part of any contractual relationship between the patient and the government for healthcare coverage. Again, these are supplemental payments. Do these supplemental payments received by a hospital that reports as a business type activity or an enterprise fund meet the definition of a subsidy? And so there's a lot of debate about this. Some people argued that it is related because if you didn't have the initial Medicaid, then this wouldn't be applicable. But the answer in this scenario was based on the fact that they're not part of the contractual relationship, right? They're supplemental payments. So as a result, in contrast to where their circumstances, there is a contractual relationship between the patient and the government. The patient has no contractual relationship for this healthcare coverage associated with the payments. Therefore, it would meet the definition because there's two parts. They are not related to goods or services provided by the hospital as part of the contractual relationship with the payment. Again, they're supplemental. And it allows the hospital's current or future charges to be lower than they would be otherwise. So again, they're addressing this question. It was a very popular question. I work with a lot of firms who do a lot of hospitals, and this was an area where they really did want some guidelines. So now we have it. Another one is for our education, right? A lot of higher ed questions that have popped up here. So a higher education institution that reports as a business type activity or enterprise fund receives donations for scholarships from individuals who do not receive goods or services in return, right? So they're making a donation specifically for scholarship, right? Give this to a student who meets certain criteria, right? Give these out as scholarships. Do these donations meet the definition of a subsidy? And the answer is yes, because again, the party who's giving this has not received a good or service, right? The students are getting it, and it allows them to keep the current or future tuition or other charges lower than they would be otherwise. So again, in this scenario, because these kids are getting these scholarships, they're able to afford this. And so they can have that adjustment for tuition purposes. So then they said, well, what happens if we don't change our published tuition rates, right? We're not changing them because we are getting these scholarships, right? They're not related. And the answer is it doesn't matter, because in this scenario, it's not whether you change your tuition rates or not. Donations directly or indirectly keep the tuition or other charges lower than they would be. So even if they don't change them, scholarships would meet that definition of a subsidy. All right, research grants. Again, higher ed, another area where they get a lot of these sort of research grants. R&D is huge for many universities that are at least R1 type of universities. They are also going to be either a business type activity or enterprise fund. Do these research grants meet the definition of a subsidy? And the answer is it depends, right? Doesn't always, it depends. It depends on the substance. So if the higher education institution receives a research grant specifically to offset operating expenses, right? So salary or lab costs, things that they would have to incur, that would exist in absence of the grant, right? This would happen whether or not the grant occurred. Then the grant funds would allow them to keep tuition or other charges lower compared to what have been charged if they did not receive the grant, right? So if they had more cost, they would have to increase tuition. Therefore, this would meet the definition of a subsidy. On the other hand, if it's not related to operating expenses, right? And again, in this scenario, in those circumstances, would not allow them to change because this is unrelated to keep the tuition or the higher ed charges lower, right? So these are going to be incremental additional expenses that are only incurred based on this particular in this particular grant, right? So as a result, therefore, they would not meet the criterion because the proceeds would not keep future or future tuition or current tuition or other charges lower than they would otherwise be. So they kind of differentiated, is it going to operating costs and salaries, people that you have to pay anyway? Or this is things that would not typically, right, not used to offset operating expenses that are a normal part of doing business. All right, then we get into the fun world of taxes. Do taxes imposed by a business type activity meet the definition of a subsidy? And again, when we look at the definition, right, taxes imposed by a business type activity, if they are received from parties who do not receive goods or services and directly or indirectly, right, that would be a yes, right? So you have to kind of look at this. So an example, they provide. Many of us who fly on airplanes frequently note that sometimes your taxes are more than the actual cost, especially if you're going overseas. Sometimes it's amazing how inexpensive the flight is, but how many taxes that you're paying for all these different jurisdictions, right? It always blows my mind when I look at the invoice. So Passenger Facility Charge Fund airport projects approved by the Federal Aviation Admission. So do passenger facility charges received by an airport that reports as a business type activity or enterprise fund meet the definition of a subsidy? And so yes, again, similar to the taxes we already talked about, these fees are imposed on passengers because they meet the definition because they're not receiving a good or service, right? This is not the ticket, right? This is an addition to, it's going to the airport, not to the airline who's going to be flying them here. And therefore it allows the airport to directly or indirectly keep their current or future fees and charges to airlines and concessionaires lower, right? So in this scenario, because it's going from the other entities in that scenario. So then the question that pops up is, okay, well, if we have these subsidies other than non-capital subsidies, right? So these are not going to be related to capital other than non-capital, right? So in those scenarios, subsidies other than non-capital subsidies are capital subsidies and should be reported as other non-operating revenues and expenses. And again, that is also looking at something in the previous 2015 implementation guide. Another question that popped up is, okay, how do we classify them if the provider of the resources limits the use to debt service for capital related debt? So in this scenario, it does qualify as a subsidy, but the provider said specifically that you can only use these subsidies for debt service. So if you have this capital related debt, maybe we're building a project, this money has to go towards the capital related, interest, debt, et cetera, that we have on that debt. So in that circumstance, the subsidy should be classified as a capital subsidy because the use of it is limited to debt service for capital debt. And that is obviously capital in nature because it's got to go towards that particular project. All right, so this is a really interesting one where, again, this is a Q&A document. It's a proposal, so there are opportunities to provide feedback. And so, again, this is a great opportunity for people to take a look. And if this is an area where you deal with airports or educational institutions or hospitals that you might want to provide feedback to the GASB. With that, I want to thank you guys so much. Here is our audit level training that's happening for the second half of the year. So as you guys are coming out of busy season, maybe you have some new interns starting this summer, or maybe people are moving up to a new level and you want to make sure that they understand why they're doing what they're doing and not just memorizing steps, that they actually understand the work they're doing. We'd love to see you in level training. But with that, I want to thank you for joining us on this week's vlog, and I hope to see you on a future vlog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.